7, if you got a Bible. Luke chapter 7. About 1,500 years ago, a 14-year-old boy retreated to the caves around Rome, from Rome, because he was so disgusted with the immorality of the Roman Empire. 14-year-old boy just decides, I'm getting away from it all, retreating into the caves because I can't stand how things are going in Rome. I got a 14-year-old boy. Times have changed. He retreats to his room to play video games, probably like your 14-year-old boy would have done. But this guy was different. This 14-year-old from 1,500 years ago, his name was Benedict. He retreated from Rome to go and focus on living a holy and devout life. He thought he needed some solitude to do that, and so he goes and spends several years by himself in search of how to live a holy life, a righteous life, a life of justice. Well, years pass, he grows up, and he gets a little older, gets pretty old, and starts to write a book. Near the end of his life, he finishes that book, and that book is really meant for three purposes. It's meant, number one, to help Christians grow into mature Christians, to help people who become Christians and want to serve God to grow into the image of Jesus Christ. Number two, it was to help the church run a little bit more in order. And number three, it was to give certain roles within the church. And so he writes a book full of a lot of rules to help people grow as Christians and to help churches function much better as followers of Christ. His book, St. Benedict's Rule, or the Rule of St. Benedict, has a lot of interesting ideas. I'll tell you, I was reading it not long ago, and in chapter 66, there's one that really caught my attention. I want to read it to you. It begins like this. At the door of the church, place a sensible old man who knows how to take a message and deliver a reply, and whose age keeps him from roaming about. I thought that was interesting. Place an old man there who doesn't have the energy to go anywhere else. Put him by the door so that he can take a message and give a reply. He's got one job. Answer the door when somebody knocks on it. He's got one job. Stay right there and answer the door when somebody shows up. He's not a teacher, doesn't lead a Bible class. He's not a preacher, doesn't preach a sermon, not a small group leader, not an elder, not a deacon. His only job is to answer the door. He goes on. Well, it doesn't seem like a whole lot of a role, but for Benedict, it was one of the most important roles that somebody could have in the functioning of a church. This sensible old man had a specific set of instructions. Here they are. Sleep in the room that's nearest the entrance so that you may hear and respond in a timely way when a visitor arrives. And as soon as you hear a knock, you go to the door, and with the warmth of love, you offer this greeting. These are the rules. You offer this greeting when somebody knocks. Thanks be to God. Bring us your blessing, please. Now, what's interesting to me is that he says that, and he has no clue who is on the other side of the door. He hasn't opened the door. It's a big door like this. You're not able to look outside. You hear the knock. You're close enough, and your response is to go to the door and say, thanks be to God that you were here. Please bring us your blessing. He has no clue who's on the other side. What he does know is that whoever it is God's gift to him on that day. And so that sensible old man would then leave that door and go out to the rest of the younger folks, and he'd say, hey, we got a visitor here, so that they could make him feel welcome or make her feel welcome. They can join together in extending this welcome. Well, for me, and maybe for you, I'm thinking about, that's a door greeter. His only job should be to open the door, right, and not make somebody have to do extra work to get in. No, it seems like a lot of rules for a door greeter, sure, unless you think it's a really important job. And for Benedict, here's what he thought. The way that we answer the door is the way that we deal with the world. Think about that for a second. He has all these rules. Put somebody there, let them sleep real close. Their only job is to answer the door, make a reply, tell them, thank God you were here. Bring us your blessing, please, and let everybody else know that there's a visitor here, so that we need to make him feel welcome. He only does that because he believes the answer, or the way that we answer the door, is the way that we deal with the world. So let me ask you, when people are trying to come to God, how do we answer them? Or maybe more likely in today's world, since we're all somewhat familiar with God, when somebody is trying to come back to God, how do we answer them? Let's face it, things may have been going okay in a lot of churches early in 2020, and then something happened that's changed a lot of things. And so a lot of people who were coming to God were not coming to God anymore. A lot of people were worshiping God, and they're not worshiping God anymore. Whenever those people try to come back to God, the way that we welcome them may make all the difference in the world. Why don't you turn your Bibles into Luke chapter 7 here? Luke chapter 7. It's an interesting story that begins in verse 36. One of the Pharisees has asked Jesus to come eat with him, and so Jesus goes to the Pharisee's house and reclines at his table. This is not uncommon. These kinds of things happened. Teachers would invite other teachers over to the house, and they would discuss certain topics or certain issues. And a lot of times they'd leave the door to the house open so that people who were just walking by, they could come by and they could hear the discussion that's taking place at the table. Well, in the very next verse, verse 37, behold, a woman of the city who's a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And she's going to really try to take care of Jesus in that setting. What we meet really, though, in Luke chapter 7 is a woman who's making an attempt, maybe it's a last-ditch attempt, to come to God, or maybe to come back to God. She's got a reputation. You probably already know it. It's not a great reputation. We don't know exactly what her chief sin is. Luke just says she's a woman of the city, a sinner. And we run with that in our minds, and we kind of make whatever we think it needs to make, and we jump to conclusions. But Luke doesn't say what the conclusion is. Luke just says she's a sinner, and she's in the city. She's a woman of the city. She's a sinner. He knows the word that you're thinking of, and he doesn't use it in this place. We do. So we don't know what she's got going on. What we do know is that she's been hearing about Jesus, and she's heard that this teacher has gone to Simon the Pharisee's house. She's been asking about it. That's the way Luke phrases it. Whenever he says in verse 37, when she learned, it's phrased in the answer to a question. Where's the teacher? She's been asking. Where's Jesus? Where's the one who's been talking about this love and grace and mercy? And where's he at? I want to go find him. I want to find him. And so finally she's figured out that Jesus is around. He's down somewhere having supper. I don't know where he is. I heard his message of love and grace and mercy and forgiveness, and I want to hear more about that. I want to go find him. And really, I want to thank him for what he's brought into my life. Where's the teacher? Where's Jesus? And so she gets an answer. Somebody finally knows where Jesus is. So there's good news and bad news. The good news is she found out where he is. He's in a house not too far from here, just down the street. You can probably get there before he's finished talking if you hurry. That's the good news. The bad news is that she knows who lives at that address. Probably not a sensible old man who's just waiting to thank God for her presence. Probably an old man who's going to reject her. Good news and bad news. Let me ask you this. If you were her, a sinful person, aware of your sin, and you knew that you needed to go to a place where you were going to be rejected, would you go? Ever thought about it? Would you go to a place where you had a feeling that they would feel that you are not welcome there? Now, many of us in this room, it's a dreary Sunday. You got up and you came to church, and that's what you do every Sunday. And the more we do that, that's great, but the more we do that, the more we forget what it's like to go to a church for the first time, especially when you hadn't been in a while. And you think about, I got to go to that place where all those faces, they're going to remember that I used to go there and I used to show up and worship. It would be a little awkward to go right now. I'm not so sure if they'll be happy to see me. I don't know if they're going to welcome me with open arms or give me the cold shoulder. I don't know. Have you ever thought about this? We go to church. We're here on Sunday morning. It's a rainy Sunday. You're here anyway. But this is a question of those who are trying to come back to God. It's a question on their mind. It's a hard thing, they say, to go back to church after you've been missing for years. Would you go to a place that you had a feeling you weren't going to be welcome? This woman in Luke chapter 7, she doesn't really care. She's figured out where Jesus is. She knows whose house he's dining in. It's a Pharisee's house, but she goes anyway. Like I said, this wouldn't have been outlandish. They left the door open for people to come in and listen to the discussion between teachers. They'd sit around. They'd recline at table. Now, the people who went in the house to hear the discussion, they didn't get to sit at the table. They sat on the outside wall. They were not welcome there at the table. And so that's where she sits. Jesus is at the table, but it may be the case that he's not very welcome there either. Customarily, the host would show some hospitalities to his guests whenever Jesus walks in, especially a notable guest like Jesus. The host would be responsible for offering a kiss of greeting on the cheek and offering a servant or something like that to wash his feet after the hot day or after walking around and anoint him with olive oil after he's been out in the heat of the day. And as you pick up reading in Luke chapter 7, you don't read about any of those things. Now, we could just kind of graze through that, like it's not, we don't greet people that way, so it's not a huge deal to us. They did, and the ancient readers would have picked up on that immediately. Jesus surely picks up on the fact that Simon's brought him to the house, but has not welcomed him in an appropriate manner. Well, the woman must notice too, because she's realized that Jesus is not properly welcome. Most would have heard this and understood that Simon is doing this to intentionally shame and humiliate Jesus by refusing to properly welcome him. But this woman's going to take care of it. She has brought perfume. Verse 38. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. And so she's recognized what Simon has neglected to do, and she realizes that this Jesus, this breathtaking man who has preached the message of grace and mercy and forgiveness to her, has been shamed and humiliated publicly and probably intentionally by Simon. And she's not going to allow that to happen. She takes her perfume, mingles it with her tears, and begins to wash his feet. Everybody in the room's a little bit shocked at this, wouldn't you be? Seems like a strange thing to happen. Things like that just don't happen. They don't talk about things like that. People like her are welcome in a place like that as long as they stay on the sidelines. But she's not staying on the sidelines. She's jumped right in. She lets her hair down, and when she does that, she has gone beyond what anybody in the room would have thought was an okay thing to do. In that society, that is just, for several reasons, not an acceptable behavior. She's gone way past that. And so with one word, Jesus could say to Simon, this woman, she's not stayed on the sidelines. She's let her hair down. She's come over here. She's kissing my feet. She's wiping me with oil and ointment, and I don't like this. With one word, Jesus could have her removed. How will he respond? Will she be welcome? Will she be cast out? Would she be welcome here? The way that we answer the door, remember, is the way that we deal with the world. Now, a good storyteller would pause right here. And man, let this question on the screen resonate with you. It's what they call a pregnant pause. We'd bring you to a point in the story where, there's a decision to make. There's tension in the story. I know what should happen. I know what would typically happen. What will happen? Well, that would be great if we could do that, but you've probably read this story before. If you haven't, maybe you've read ahead this morning already, and you know that she's going to be welcome. We know what response Jesus is going to make. He's not going to give her the cold shoulder. He's not going to cast her out. He's not going to get Simon to arrest her. It'd be fun to sit and think about what he would do, but we don't have that opportunity. After hearing this story and being familiar with it, we know that Jesus is going to do what Jesus tends to do. And so we've lost the ability to consider how shocking what he's about to do really is. We've lost the ability really to be surprised at some of these drastic, outlandish actions of Jesus. The Jesus that we know and expect to show up is the one who's going to show up. Of course he's going to welcome her. Of course he's going to bring her in, and he's going to make her kind of the hero of this story. But what he does, the way he welcomes her, is unthinkable to most, especially the host. And so as you read through Luke chapter 7, you and I, the reader is invited into Simon's room. We're invited into his house, and we get to watch as two notable religious leaders are suddenly in the presence of a woman who has no standing there at all. Two religious leaders are suddenly in the presence of a woman who's been cast out of religion, not allowed to go back. She's a sinner, and both of the religious leaders know it. Now, one of them has an understanding of righteousness and holiness that says, I can't be around her. I can't be in the presence of a sinful woman like this. She doesn't need to be in my house. This is awful. And the other one has an understanding of righteousness and justice and kindness that demands that he offer a welcome to this woman who's usually unwelcome, and that he move toward this woman who most people would rather move away from, and that he offers her a blessing of peace that she's not been able to comprehend in years. This is the heart of the way Jesus understands how people relate to one another. Unlike the Pharisee, who looks at that woman and can only see her past, Jesus looks at her and can see the potential that her life has. Now, I know that sounds like one of those little short preacher statements that we make sometimes to be memorable, but I'm not saying that just because it sounds good and it's memorable in your minds. I'm saying that because that's what really happens in this story. Simon's looking at her and he's saying, what in the world is this woman doing in my house? And not only in my house, what in the world is this woman doing over here trying to minister to Jesus? All I can see is what she's been doing in her life. She's a sinner, a woman of the city. And Jesus looks at her and sees not just what she has been or even what she is today, but the potential that God has for her. Jesus understands the potential that love and forgiveness have for changing somebody's life. And so Jesus wants to welcome this woman and invite her into a better life. He knows that he must shine as a light, and the light only makes sense if it shines into the darkness, if it's going to have any effect. Simon, the Pharisee, doesn't endorse her lifestyle, wants to remain separate, wants her out of there, thinks that she's better off outside. Jesus couldn't disagree more. He knows that she's right where she needs to be. Simon is not there yet. Now, he doesn't say it out loud. Look at what he does here. Now the Pharisee, verse 39, who had invited him saw this. He said to himself. He didn't say it out loud. He never would. That would look bad. It'd be shameful if he said that. And so he says it to himself. In Luke's writing, and in much of the ancient world's writing, that's what people do whenever they're ashamed to speak what they really think deep down. They speak to themselves. Later on in the same passage, the people around the table with Jesus, they're going to speak among themselves about what they're going to do with this Jesus. And so Simon doesn't speak it out loud. He says it to himself. If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. He doesn't say it out loud, but deep down, Simon's thinking, she's got a past. Does he not know that she's a sinner? Does he not know she's a woman of the city? Does he not know where she's been and who she's been with and how many times? And does he not know what this woman's got going on? He doesn't say it out loud, never would. We wouldn't either. But it's a good thing Jesus knows his thoughts. Maybe a frightening thing that Jesus knows ours. But Jesus looks at him and he says, Simon, I have something to say to you. That's ancient speak for this is going to be blunt and you're not going to like what I'm about to say, but you need to hear it anyway. And he says two people. He tells them a parable. A certain money lender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither one of them could pay, and so the money lender cancels the debt of both of them. And Jesus says, very simple question, which one is going to love him more or appreciate him more? Which one is that going to make the most difference to? Well, the answer is easy. You got one guy who in our money today, he's got a debt of about $50,000. You got another guy who owes $500,000. Neither one of them can pay the bill. They go down to the bank and say, I can't pay. I don't know what to do. And the banker says, it's okay. I've forgiven your debt. One had $50,000 wiped off the books. One had $500,000 wiped off the books. Which one is going to be more appreciative? Well, both ought to be. But one's definitely got more to be thankful for. And so Jesus unfolds the meaning there in Simon's presence in case we miss it. He's the one forgiving the debt. The woman is the one with the very large debt. And Simon, there are two people in the parable who have debts. Simon doesn't know it yet, but he's got to be the other one. Now, he'd never admit it. He's a righteous guy. But the fact that he would never admit it explains why he didn't welcome Jesus, why his love is not overflowing for Jesus, and he didn't get the customary hospitalities. Simon thought that Jesus ought to be in the business of avoiding sinners, and Jesus is saying, if that were true, Simon, I wouldn't be in your house either. Simon doesn't recognize his sin, and so he doesn't show much love. The sinful woman knows all too well her sin, and her love and honor and thankfulness to Jesus is overflowing. In his words, she loves much because she has been forgiven much. And so Jesus invites Simon to make a response. Which one's going to love him more, he says, verse 42. Well, verse 43, Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, you've judged rightly. And then turning to the woman, he said to Simon, Simon, do you see her? And he recalls to Simon's mind, I came in here and you didn't give me any water for my feet. You saw me here, and I came in, I was walking here, you didn't give me any water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them up with her hair. What's the difference, Simon? That's what he's inviting him to ask. What's the difference in you and her? And then he says, you gave me no kiss. That would be customary. That's what you ought to do for somebody who's come to forgive you. You didn't do that. But from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. She saw what you didn't do, Simon. Here she is taking up your slack. What's the difference in you and her, Simon? Verse 46, you didn't anoint my head with oil. That would have been customary, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. And therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, and Simon's right there with him on that. I know she's got a lot of sin. Her sins, which are many, are forgiven, and she's loved much. But he who is forgiven little, and that's what Simon thinks of himself, he loves little. Jesus explains it. Simon, you're a sinner too. You just don't realize it, and that's why you're not treating me in the right way. This woman knows her sin all too well, and she's facing it. She's challenging it, and she's forgiveness for it. And so Jesus concludes this, verse 48, your sins are forgiven. Then those who were at table with him began to say among themselves, there it is again. They're not saying it outright. They're discussing it. Who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Your faith has made you whole. Your faith has saved you, Jesus tells her. And you know what faith is. It's in Scripture, right? Faith is trust in what you're not sure of and what you've not seen. It's trusting that even though you've not laid eyes on it, that it's real. That's what faith is. And this woman is trusting that even if all the people that she's ever known have refused her and made her feel unwelcome and insisted on labeling her by her past, even if everybody she's ever known has treated her in that way, she has faith that Jesus does not treat her that way. That's the faith. He would grant the forgiveness that they had all withheld. She's never seen that, but she has faith and hope and trust in Jesus to provide that. This is a woman who wants to start all over again, and Jesus is the first person who's ever invited her to have a fresh start. Simon's not sure it can be done. Jesus looks at her and sees the potential of what God can do with her. Simon looks at her and sees only what she has been, and he's just not real sure that somebody like her can start over and get a redo. He's not sure about that. Maybe we're not sure either. What do we do when that person comes to my door? What do we do when she comes to the door of our lives, of our houses, of our church buildings? I got to tell you that there are still people like her in the world wanting to start over again, but they're not sure it can be done. Are we? Are they welcome here? The sign says all are welcome. Are they really? The way we answer the door, remember, is the way that we deal with the world. There are a lot of challenging statements in Luke chapter 7. There are a lot of things I read and I'm thinking, oh man, I wish that wasn't in there. Wish that Jesus didn't do that. I wish that she didn't treat him in that way. A lot of lines in this story may prove to be challenging for us. There's the presence of a sinful woman in a righteous man's house. There's the way that this sinful woman approaches the most righteous man, Jesus, and touches him. There's this uncomfortable, awkward inner dialogue that Simon has. There's the way that Jesus calls him out on the thoughts that he's not man enough to speak. There's the way that Jesus forgives this woman for her past and offers her a better way. But I got to tell you, the most challenging line in the whole story is the last one. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Where in the world does a woman like that go in peace? Where does she go? I mean, that sounds great on paper. It's a fitting way to end this story. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Sounds great, unless you try to figure out what that woman does when she walks out of Simon's house. Where does she go to find peace in the world? The price of her lifestyle has been cutting herself off from the very institutions that would generally offer her peace, to the point where really the only place that she probably finds herself welcome is back out on the street among people like herself, the people that she's trying to leave behind and live a different kind of lifestyle. Where does she go when Jesus tells her to go in peace? What group of people would be welcoming to somebody like her? What gathering of people would want somebody like her in their midst? What congregation would meet her at the door and say, "Thank God you're here. Bring us your blessing"? In case you miss it, this is the invitation for the church to consider our ministry for those who are still outside these four walls today. Go in peace, he tells her, and that's easier said than done, if we're being honest. What she needs is a community of forgiven and forgiving sinners. A community of people who've been forgiven and are in turn forgiving of other people. That's a church. Not a bunch of folks like Simon who forgot they ever had any sin, or definitely not on board with checking out their sin today. Not a bunch of folks like that. See, Simon is still interested in this, who is the lesser debtor here? Who's the one who has the smaller price that's been forgiven? Well, for Jesus, it seems that none of us really fit into that lesser debtor category. It just doesn't exist. We are all indebted. And so as we meet people who are radically out of touch with God and their lives show it, sometimes we want to put the cart before the horse and we expect them to clean up their lives and then you can go to church. Reality is that church is often what God uses to clean up a life. And the way we answer the door when they show up is the way that we deal with the world. The church is a group of people that God often uses to help other people clean up their lives. If that's not the case, then what in the world are we even doing here? And what are we doing if we're looking down at people who are trying to come to God or come back to God? Disdain for others has no place within the church. That's not the kind of group that Jesus called. She needs a church, yes, but she doesn't need a group of folks who are just going to overlook what she's doing. You see, there's two ends of this spectrum, right? She doesn't need one that's going to overlook all the flaws and the faults of what she's been doing and think of it as no big deal, because it is a big deal. The life that we live is a big deal. The sins that we commit, they are big deals. We can't just act like it never happened and sweep those sins under Simon's rug and act like they just don't exist. They do exist. And God expects more than that from us, more than that from his people. Yes, he welcomes this woman as she is, but he tells her, when you leave this place, your life ought to be different. Go in peace. He tells the woman caught in the very act of adultery, yes, neither do I condemn you, but go and sin no more. We don't overlook the sin. God expects more than that from us. God will welcome us as we are, but he will not leave us that way. She needs a church that will not leave her in that way. This story in Luke chapter 7, it screams the need for a church. So Jesus defends her and Jesus welcomes her, and in doing so, he carves out a place for her within the community of the people who are following after him. And he leaves this story with us that leaves us with the need for a church, a group of people, not just any church, a group of people who will answer the door when people show up. And like that sensible old man from 1,500 years ago, who will say, thanks be to God that you are here. Bring us your blessing. You are welcome here. The question is, the way we answer the door is how we deal with the world. And the question is, do I see people more for who they have been or who they can be? One of those is the perspective of Simon the Pharisee. He looks at her and he says, I don't understand why Jesus would allow somebody like her to touch somebody like him. He must not be a man of God, must not be a prophet. One of those is the perspective of Simon. And one of those is the perspective of Jesus. Have you ever considered why those who were outcasts, tax collectors, the sinners, the women of the city like this woman, why were people like that so drawn to Jesus? It's not that he offers them an easy life. He made challenges on them, called them to higher lives, called them to higher standards. It's not that he says, hey, it's easy to follow me. He never says that. He tells them to consider the cost of discipleship. He tells them that this could be a tough life. He asks them, are you sure that you can endure the suffering that I'm going? It's not an easy life that he's calling them to. So why are the tax collectors and the sinners like this woman so inclined and interested in following Jesus? What do they see in him that makes them so interested in the message that he preaches and the life that he lives? And why is it that we're not seeing the same interest in the church today? I don't know the answer to that, but could it be that maybe we've seen people for who they have been and not so much for who they can be? Are they welcome here? Sign says all are welcome. Are they really? Is our response to people who come to our door, remember the way you answer the door is the way you deal with the world. Is our response when people knock on the door, thanks be to God, bring your blessing to us? Or is it thanks be to God that I'm not a sinner like them? Now that message doesn't come until Luke chapter 18, but I think it fits pretty good right here. In the end, Jesus offers forgiveness both to Simon and to this sinful woman. She obviously accepts. There's no missing that in the story. Well, what will Simon do? I don't know. We're not told. The story ends too soon. Jesus doesn't make it easy on us and fill in the blanks. What will Simon do? I don't know. He doesn't tell us. But at the end of the day, that's not the question, is it? It's not a question of what will Simon do. It's a question of what will we do. Will we be more like Simon, who looks at people who are trying to come to God, trying to come back to God, and is just not so sure that it can happen, keeping them at a distance? Will we be more like Jesus, who welcomes? Thanks to God for bringing us this blessing. Or maybe we are more like the sinful woman who is out there and we've been living our life and we've been doing what we've been doing, and whatever that is, Luke doesn't tell us, doesn't make it clear, it's open-ended. We can fill in the blank with our own sin. And so maybe you or I or we are the ones who need to come to God this morning. Maybe we're the ones who need to make the change in our lives. We need the forgiveness, the fresh start that Jesus offers. And so maybe for you today, I don't know what that means, where you are, but if you're somebody who's not a Christian, that means you get started on this walk with Jesus, professing your faith and trust. That's what the woman does in him. Turning away from a life of sin, that's what she does. Being baptized, having your sins washed away, fresh start, coming up out of the water to enjoy this new life of following Jesus, living the life that he's called us to live. It's not easy. Nobody ever said it's easy. It's meaningful. It's what God wants out of us. He doesn't invite them to an easy life. It's a challenge. It's a struggle. It's the best life. So maybe today you need that forgiveness to begin that fresh start. Or maybe you're more like Simon. What you need is to be more welcoming to those who are seeking that forgiveness, those fresh starts. The sign says all are welcome. Are they? What do we do when somebody like that comes to a door of our lives, of our house, of our church? We welcome them with the greeting of the sensible old man from 1,500 years ago. Thanks be to God. Bring your blessing to us. You are God's gift to us. Or is it a little worse than that? What will we do? How will we respond? We know what the woman does. She seeks the forgiveness, leaves in obedience, and has a fresh start on life. We don't know what Simon does. I'm hoping that he sees it, sees the truth, turns his life around, recognizes what kind of person he needs to be. But I don't know. That's not the question. The question is, what will you do? What will I do? What will we do The way we answer the call is the way we deal with the world. You have a response to that call. Why don't you make it known while together we stand and while we sing?